Welcome to No Franchise Fatigue, the podcast where we don't care if a film series has 13 and a half years worth of sequels, prequels, remakes, or spin offs. And in fact, we celebrate it. Once again, I'm joined by my ever so lovely and diabolically vengeful co host, Sean. How are you doing today, Sean?
Don't cross me.
Oh,
No.
yeah. Hey, I'm not crossing nobody today. Not after the films that we just watched.
Oh boy, you are not kidding.
Today, we're going to be talking about a trilogy that has done probably one of the most incredible feats I've ever seen, which is bridge the gap between diehard snobby cinephiles and the genre punks. So today we're talking about Park Chan-wook's iconic set of three films, lovingly known as either the Revenge Trilogy or the Vengeance Trilogy, kind of depending on when you kind of dug into these films is kind of what you refer to them as.
Yeah,
So yeah, so
only Revenge Trilogy to me. I was on this train from the word go myself.
whereas, like, for me, the Vengeance trilogy, I didn't really dig into it until I saw Oldboy. In fact, Oldboy was the first Blu-ray I ever bought.
Yeah,
And I think it was like $40. It was the Tartan
it, the
Extreme.
one that came with the first volume of the comic.
Yep.
Yeah,
So that was the Blu-ray I first bought. I remember at the time I was working as a manager for a large movie and music store. And I remember having to special order that in. It was the first Blu-ray I bought when I got a Blu-ray player. So the movie's always kind of meant a lot to me. At that time, I had not seen the other two. When I saw Oldboy, bought the Blu-ray. I'd seen Oldboy previously. So when I got the new Blu-ray, decided to jump in, watch all three. Ended up buying all the Tartan DVDs for the other two to kind of watch them all together. And I still have those copies to this day, as they've never left my collection.
oh, and in the day, Tartan, and especially like their Tartan Asian Extreme, was awesome for a fan of any kind of foreign horror, foreign action. Yeah, I was always a big
Oh,
fan.
yeah, I think in the early 2000s, they were one of the labels that opened my mind to a lot of cinema. I mean, I grew up on Hong Kong cinema. I grew up in my teens. I remember when I think I was 15 years old when my brother, for my birthday, bought me A Better Tomorrow and A Better Tomorrow 2 on VHS
Oh,
through Anchor Bay. And so, like, I grew up on Hong Kong films, but Japanese cinema and particularly Korean cinema wasn't something I really discovered until much later. And the Tartan Asian Extreme label was a huge factor in that, including introducing me to Oldboy, introducing me to a variety of other films and iconic stars, and particularly the new wave of Korean cinema that essentially Park Chan-wook as a director kind of put back on the map.
absolutely did. I myself grew up as a anime nerd and huge gamer, so I ended up seeking out Japanese cinema from that angle and ended up falling in love with. That's actually where my love of gore and body horror comes from. Is an accidental cross section there. That's when I learned something about myself. uh,
I mean, that's fair. That's fair.
First time you see something like Battle Royale, and first time you see that, you're just like, whoa. And that is actually the angle I came to Oldboy from, which was also my first in this series, because it was a Tartan Asian Extreme and it had a really cool box, and it came with a comic that was very specifically Japanese. I didn't even realize it was a Korean movie until I put it in. I wasn't like offended by it, but I was like, oh, well, that was a left turn.
Right. And I think Oldboy is a great entry point for a lot of people. I mean, the fact that Quentin Tarantino had a quote on it, there's some famous stories about cans.
Yeah, he literally fought for it to take Palme d'Or that year, and Fahrenheit 9/11 took it instead. It got the Grand Prix instead.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it winning an award really kind of solidified the new wave of South Korean cinema that was happening, particularly of the genre flair.
Yep.
And Quentin Tarantino, love him or hate him as a filmmaker, as a person, when he puts his name on something, it usually gets it a following. It usually has some kind of an impact for a Western audience, and so I cannot fault him for that. And it's quotes like his on that, or The Protector with Tony Jaa,
Mhm.
that led me in a direction.
And I think everybody has feelings on Quentin Tarantino because he got so many of us into film generally. Even fans of genre have grown to kind of trust his word because, right, wrong, or indifferent, the man has impeccable genre taste.
Right, right. Absolutely. He, his work with the New Beverly is astounding, and I think his programming to this day of like the older films he'll grab, to introduce a new audience to that, again, I can't fault him in that. There's a lot of things I don't necessarily like about the old QT in this, and Oldboy is a prime example of that. And I think that without him, despite the fact of the quality that Park Chan-wook brings to cinema in general, is, you know, his ability to affect a Western audience would not be, I don't think, where it is without, Quentin Tarantino just vouching for him a little bit. And going into the films, and we're going to go into them here in a second, but I think that Park Chan-wook in general has had a stellar record as a director. And when you think that like one of his lesser films is Joint Security Area, and that film's phenomenal, and that's like his weakest film, and it's kind of mind-boggling. It's just, I don't even know where to go with that. But I mean, it was the film right before Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance, which is where we're going in this trilogy. I
And
think it's
enough money. Sorry, that's it ended up making enough money and did well enough that he was trusted on his next film to just kind of do what he wanted, which is got why it was so independent and had such a strong independent voice, which was really cool. Actually, he really does come out the gate with this one, which please by all means introduce our first movie.
right, yeah. And so the first film of the Vengeance or Revenge trilogy is Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance. This is a film released in 2002. As we said, it was his follow-up to Joint Security Area, which was a box office success, allowed him a little bit of freedom in those regards. This will be the first film that you see a lot of his themes throughout his entire filmography come up. Is in through this film. And I'm sure at the very end of this episode we'll probably do a little ranking of the three Vengeance films, just to for our audience and everything, so that we can talk a little bit about that, how they not only just how they relate to each other. But Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance, I think, is a phenomenal film, and it's one that every time I rewatch it, there's something new I find to it. There's some new depth to it. There's impactful and bold choices made in this film for a young filmmaker, and I think for me, it's still one of his strongest films in his filmography.
Absolutely. And as always, we will be delving right into spoilers. So, fair warning if you have not seen Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance, which I highly suggest you do. There is a lot happening, and there is a lot of emotional depth in the twists and turns because they're all little tragedies in their own way.
I think you're absolutely right. Particularly in a Park Chan-wook film, his twists and turns are what make the films great. It's not just execution, it's not just narrative, it's the combination of both. And in Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance, this is a film where, we have essentially a lead character, and we could even argue that point is who's the true narrator of this film, who is driving the action of the film.
Ryu, the deaf young man. He's only like what, 22 maybe, or supposed to be.
Right, right.
And so basically, the situation he finds himself in is that his sister has kidney failure, and he is not a blood type match to donate his kidney. So, in desperation, he tries to get a kidney on the black market, trading one of his own and basically all the money he had in hopes of getting a kidney. And then he is basically dumped in an abandoned warehouse with no kidney and no money.
Yep. And from there, it's like he partners up with his girlfriend, who is at the time in the film, you understand that she's kind of a one-woman army of resistance against the man and a political thing. She's the one that suggests to him that the way to get the money back to be able to get a new kidney for his sister is to kidnap the young daughter of the boss, who has recently laid off an entire workforce at the factory that he's at.
Which,
From there,
yes. So yeah, young anarchist girlfriend, which she's also, I believe, a communist, specifically like a communist terrorist. um, which sounds like it plays off for laughter a little bit, and it's kind of a bit of dark humor, but it also plays into the ending a bit in the sense that his movies are definitely unflinching in the sense of the human condition. None of these characters are portrayed as heroic, but none of them are portrayed as villainous either. They are mostly people, except for Oldboy, but we'll get there. Um, but it's mostly about people in extreme situations doing the best they can. And so in that sense, you just that's one of the things he uses to build sympathy is yes, she does end up convincing Ryu that their best move is to kidnap not even the boss's daughter, the boss's friend's daughter, because they didn't want the direct connection, which clever. But oof.
Yeah, it's hard to get into these films, and we'll get into a lot of the themes. Like you said, this is something that you'll see replicated throughout the films, through Oldboy, through Lady Vengeance, or as the Tartan DVD says, Sympathy for Lady Vengeance, kind of being a callback. Yeah, in general, it's a film that's about, like you said, characters in a rough situation where no one's a hero, no one's a villain. And I definitely have some thoughts about that, particularly as we go on to the in the next two films, and once we can start to analyze them as a franchise together. At this point, I think it should be known that this is very, very loosely a franchise. This is a thematic franchise
Yes.
for
It's
the
just
three
three
films.
revenge movies he made back to back to back with a lot of thematic ties. But there are, yes, it should be noted, although most things we ever do with this series are going to be more directly plot related, or, boy, not always. Franchises get weird. But this
There's
is
a
definitely a thematic trilogy.
Right. It doesn't have the direct connections that a normal trilogy would, particularly in a lead character that's carried through or anything like that, or some kind of it's literally a thematic trilogy. And thematic trilogies are something that, I grew up used to. Mentioning my history with Hong Kong cinema, that's not something unusual for Chinese franchises to be thematic sequels. Usually it's in name only. They'll just slap the title onto a sequel and call it good because there's usually similar themes. So they're, modern films like SPL will heavily pull on thematic franchises. So it's not something that's unusual, but even then, what even makes this more unusual as a franchise is the fact that it was never really intended to be a trilogy. It's something that the critics and fans put together, and marketing and the filmmakers ran with it. It was like, okay, yeah, I guess this kind of works as a trilogy. Let's slap it all together and sell it that way, package it that way. I mean, you can buy Blu-rays that are called the Vengeance Trilogy here in the US and the UK, And so I think that's a really interesting note to make, particularly as we start to talk about Oldboy, because you'll notice when we start to look at the basic plot of Oldboy, it has nothing to do with Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance.
As a matter of fact, all three setups are inherently different. They're all even told in different ways, actually, because this is a multifocal, more or less real time drama, The Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance. So, bouncing forward with it a little bit, basically, he brings this kidnapped girl who thinks she's being babysat. She doesn't even realize she's kidnapped to his apartment with his sister, who basically, when they're making the money exchange, she ends up putting together that this little girl is kidnapped and why, because he needs money to get her the surgery because he lost all his money in this organ chop shop.
Organ chop shop.
And, uh, but when she realizes this, she ends up feeling so guilty about it, she kills herself. So then suddenly Ryu's got the money and this little girl, and his sister's dead. So he goes to bury her at the kind of lake where they played as children, and being as he is deaf, does not hear the little girl fall into the lake where she drowns.
I'm trying so hard not to laugh because this movie is so heavy and so dark, and
It's
and yet
more uncomfortable laughter because it's not funny. It's just like, how much worse could this day get?
Absolutely, and that's what's really interesting about this film, and even compared to the other two films, this film has no villain.
Yeah.
You know, the title is Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance. Going into the film, you automatically ask yourself, well, who's Mr. Vengeance, right?
Yeah.
And and really, this film, Mr. Vengeance, is a little bit of everybody. You know, it's a little bit of the villain of the film ends up being not a person, but strictly circumstance ends up being the villain of this film because it's the antagonist against every character in this film. And I think for me, that is why it works so incredibly well. Is the film works on a level where everything exists in a gray area.
So something my dad used to always say as just one of those fatherly mottos. I really, it just, while I was rewatching this movie, it actually hit me is that revenge is like drinking poison and expecting someone else to die. And I really think, like, thematically, that is kind of what this movie's about because from that point, it becomes the tale of two men's vengeance. The father of the little girl and Ryu trying to take revenge on the organ thieves. And
Yeah.
these plots literally kind of play out simultaneously.
And it's I think the way that it plays out is fantastic, and there's twists and turns in it. You know, as we stated, the little girl drowns, and then her father goes into a stupor and decides to swear a revenge against the kidnappers. And at this point, the kidnappers are the protagonist of the story. They are the ones that are driving the narrative. And at this point, this movie takes a little bit of a side shuffle over and then proceeds to kind of follow the father character who had only previously appeared in the movie in a couple of small sequences, more or less to introduce the daughter character that was going to be kidnapped. And so the film does an interesting thing, slides in, changes protagonist at this point to this father figure who's going to get revenge. And then at this point, it becomes a game of cat and mouse.
What I think the movie does interestingly in setting his character up very rapidly, though, is like you say, he's mostly off screen. So instead, what they do is they allow us to get to know his little girl really well. And that gives you sympathy for Mr. Vengeance instantly.
Right. And so, yeah, it becomes this interesting game. And in the hands of any other filmmaker, it's easy to see how this film could have been completely restructured into something different, where the kidnapping happens in the first 15 minutes. We
Sure.
get some basic structures, and then the rest of the film is this duality of these two men essentially playing cat and mouse against one another, one trying to survive and the other one looking for vengeance. That is the more basic film in here. And Park Chan-wook does not play into any of that. He plays into his own story. He builds the narrative where we care about the kidnappers. We feel for them, and then everything that happens, their intentions, I mean, it's kidnapping, but their intentions with it are that they will not hurt the girl. The girl is, they're in a situation where they need the money. They have to, their hand is almost played for them.
And
And
on top of that, they actually, not only that, they went in with the best of intentions. His girlfriend, Ryu's girlfriend, says the reason people hate kidnappers is they always kill the children. If we return the child, people won't hate us. Like, they really, really went in with as good of intentions as possible, given that they were planning to kidnap a child.
right. Well, and then even then, it's like this kidnapping, like you said, it's almost like she's at the babysitter. They kind of, it's not like she's tied up. It's not like it's, and there's even a scene where they're trying to convince the father that, you know, she's been kidnapped to get her to cry for the picture that they're going to send. They like break a toy and then apologize and give her a new toy
Yeah.
just to get her to cry for that moment, for that one moment. And so you get this idea that the little girl never feels like she's in danger. She never feels threatened, you know, is playing with these people. And then it's just the circumstances around them that completely just shit the bed over and over again. And it's by the time you get to the finale, as these two men are going to collision, you realize that there's all these little hints throughout the film of how the ending is going to play out, so that when it plays out, it's a shock, but you're like, oh shit, this is exactly how it was always going to play out.
Exactly.
So,
Which does end with the girl's father does kill Ryu in the same lake. Ugh. Including one of the few things that always makes me shudder, which is by slicing his Achilles tendons from underneath him while he's standing in the water.
So he can't stand in the water and drowns. So phenomenal. So, yeah,
But
it's
as he gets up on land, the girlfriend's terrorist group kills him back, and everybody dies and nobody's happy.
a terrorist group that to this point we've never believed was real.
Yeah, we always thought she was just kind of all. We thought she was all talk.
Yeah, all talk. We only see her handing out these flyers. She's, she talks big, but she's not super involved in the film itself outside of taking care of the little girl and until later. And she threatens at one point because the father figure gets a hold of her and ends up torturing her to find out where Ryu is, and ends up, killing her. And she makes the statement throughout the entire sequence: if I die, they're going to come find me and they're going to find you and kill you. And you just think she's just talking out of her ass. You're just like, and then it all comes true at the very end. He kills Ryu.
It's actually a funny way to set up a twist because she just straight ass tells him it's going to happen.
And vicariously tells the audience it's going to happen. This is what's going to happen in the end of the movie, and you never believe it. You never believe it. So when the time comes and he's disposing of Ryu's body, you see these guys pull up, and you're like, who are these people? Like, who are these characters? And then when it dawns on you as an audience member, you're like, oh my God, this film told me this was going to happen for the last 30 minutes. And it's still a shock. And I think testament to Park Chan-wook for pulling that off.
So that is Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance, which I think we would both agree is just a phenomenal movie.
Yeah, we'll get into that with both Oldboy and Lady Vengeance, but there's not really a misfire in this trilogy.
Nope. And that, not to spoil it going forward, but these are all three just excellent movies. It's a difference of degrees when you're ranking them, honestly.
Absolutely, I agree. So my ranking at the end, I'm really curious to hear your ranking,
Mhm.
simply because of that, because it literally day to day my ranking changes. So I'm not even sure I know what my ranking is at this point.
So, rolling on into the most familiar of all of these would be, of course, Oldboy. So, I think we spoke a little bit about it in the intro, how introductive. I think I just made that word up, but I'm rolling with it. How
Okay, I like it. I like it. Introductive.
it was to many Asian extreme and generally just genre cinema because, like you said, this movie literally crosses the gap. This is a legitimate art film, and it is a very legitimate genre film.
Well, and kind of going back also to our introduction, you spoke about you kind of went into Oldboy from being a Japanese cinema fanatic and an anime fan, and the fact that it's based on source material that's not original, that it's based on
Japanese comic.
yep, it's based on a comic, it's based on a manga, and you know it's interesting that Park Chan Wook at this point follows up because this is, if memory serves, the next film after Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance. He had only
Later. Oh, these movies were straight in a row. It was 2002, 2003, 2005.
oh wow, okay, so he really does nail this right in a row, bang bang bang. Yep. So Oldboy kind of comes out. The film itself, and we'll talk a little bit about the themes and shortly, but the film itself follows, Ode Soo, who is, and pardon me if I mispronounce any of the names in this. I do not speak Korean,
Same.
and
I apologize.
so any listeners out there, I'm sure Twitter will go on fire as film Twitter always is. It's just a dumpster fire half the time. Film Twitter is both the greatest and worst thing to ever happen to cinema in the modern age.
Probably.
But so Odesu, literally the opening sequence, you see him drunk. He is rescued by his assistant because he's some kind of a wealthy businessman. You get this idea that he is a well-to-do off gentleman with a family, and he immediately is kidnapped. Because kidnapping, Park Chan-wook loves him some good old-fashioned kidnapping.
True story.
In this case, it's man napping. They nap a man.
But this one's interesting because he's not taken for ransom. He's put in a hotel room with a bed a television, and a painting that says "Smile, and the world smiles with you."
It's
And he's fed literally the same thing every day through a trap door. It's like noodles and uh, gyoza, like pork dumplings.
right. And he has this is what happens to him. He's put in prison. This is actually a thing I'm going to bring up later is about prisons. But he's put in essentially a private prison and he's forced to live there. It's 15 years
15
over.
years. Yep.
So
Nope, 15 years on the nose.
15 years. And he lives there for 15 years. He is released randomly, has no idea why. He has lived in this prison. You get the idea that they weirdly take care of him. They feed him, they clothe him. It is a prison system in all meanings of the word.
Although
And
see another person the whole time because anytime they would do something like change his clothes, they'd gas him first.
right,
So
no, he's unconscious.
Pure isolation, save for a television. So he got news. He was aware that time was passing. They didn't want him to go completely insane, although bad news.
Well, right. And that's almost kind of the point of this film is like this idea of isolation and looking at the themes for his character that way.
And before we roll past it too quickly in terms of the synopsis, really important scene as soon as he gets released is he meets this guy who's about to jump off a roof with his dog. And he basically tells this guy his story of being imprisoned, Odeshu does. And the guy says to him, even though I'm nothing more than a beast, don't I still deserve to live?
The beast line comes up again and again. The line from the painting, laugh and the world laughs with you, weep and you weep alone. That line comes up again and again. They use that.
There's this movie, and I'm only bringing it up because it's pretty much the only theme that is unique to this movie. But this movie does have a distinct theme of loneliness that I find fascinating, that presents itself in ways like he's on a subway and he actually has like hallucination of an ant.
Yeah, and the film even, I believe, the sushi chef, which soon becomes his girlfriend, sort of, which later on is twisted even further. But I believe she even straight up says that she's like, do you still dream of ants, or do you still see ants? Because that comes up again and again about the ants, and that kind of that loneliness. So I think you're right. That's absolutely a theme of this film. And a theme to this film that's not necessarily replicated in the other two films. That's pretty unique to this one.
This one. But I mean, it's a man that was in a solo room for 15 years. Like that's definitely going to be inherent to that because it's easy to brush past when you're talking about it like a synopsis, but even taking a second to actually think about what that would be like, it's horrifying. It's a horrifying thought.
Well, and
this
even
also delves into emotional horror in an interesting way.
oh, absolutely. And kind of going off of that, this was a note that I took because this movie's dark. This movie's even darker than Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance, as far as I'm concerned. I think it's much darker than that. But in the first 22 minutes of this film, there are 2 attempted suicides and 1 successful one portrayed on screen.
Oh my God, that is true. Jesus.
Yes. So that is how dark this movie is. And that's how dark this movie comes out. 22 minutes is your first act. So this is a film that's not shying away from things. It is laying things out. He attempts committing suicide in his prison at one point. He slits his wrist. They save him, which is like almost worse, right? Like it's like this horrible thing. And even better is he bleeds out all over the carpet, and they try to clean it up. They can't clean it up. So for the rest of that sequence when he's in his prison, you can see that giant blood stain in the middle of the carpet from where he tried to commit suicide, which is this horrible reminder of what he is even unable to do, which is, he has no control over his own life. He can't even take it. And I think that is that key to that loneliness part.
Also, I always like the set design in that particular part of the movie because you've also got the slowly scuffed wall as he's shadowboxing because he never went complacent either. He actually basically did all the exercises he could do calisthenics wise without any weights or anything, and then he just shadow boxed and punched the wall until his knuckles were tough as steel. And like, he definitely didn't waste his 15 years like I probably would have.
Right, just watching TV, right? um,
Anyway, it wouldn't be functionally different.
so yeah, I mean, and there's even like you know, and we're still here in this first 20 minutes of this film, but he even attempts to escape the prison. He has cut a hole in the wall, and he finally gets to a point where he can see the outside, and he can put his hand outside, and he feels the rain for the first time in 15 years, and it's right then that he gets released, which is again this weird twist of fate in humor, and humor is a big part of Park Chan-wook's style, is really, really dark humor.
Really dark humor, but funny nonetheless.
But funny nonetheless. And so like even that, you're like, okay, like he did all this work for 15 years to dig through the wall, and as soon as he does, the guy lets him go. So and it's great. At this point though, he's released into the world. He meets this gentleman on the roof who has the line about the beast. He has no idea why he's been released. He has no idea why he's been imprisoned, and he's essentially given a suit, some money, and told to go forth. And this is where the revenge portion of it comes out, because he has decided that he will get revenge on the man who imprisoned him for
Because
15 years.
one thing we should have mentioned in the setup is his wife was murdered and he was blamed for it. So he lost his wife and daughter in this trade too, because he ends up finding out very early on that she was sent to Sweden.
Right. Which is another theme that comes up in Sympathy for Lady Vengeance, which we'll talk about here in a second, about a child that's sent to a Western country, which is really interesting. Yeah, at this point, he's released into the world. He starts to put things together. He ends up at a sushi shop where he meets a young woman who is a popular sushi chef, which he says he has seen her on TV. She was on some kind of a reality show as one of the best sushi chefs in Korea. And her role in this very much pulls from the manga, like this idea of a chef, right? Because sushi is, in the chef, and the art of it is something that's really skillful, and something that you don't see a lot in, say, Korean cinema. Is the use of that as a thematic element, but it certainly comes up here, which I believe is from the source material. But he meets her. She kind of takes him in, and kind of starts to help him out with things. And
to all
quickly,
the Chinese restaurants that they can think of, because he's trying to find the food he'd been tasting, because he's got no idea where he was imprisoned. He was taken away, so he's trying to track down what happened to him. And they basically finds the Chinese restaurants, and he finds where he was imprisoned, and basically goes up to the warden with a hammer and rips his teeth out until he gets some information with the
yes.
end of a claw hammer, which for a lot of us was the first time we'd seen that particular style of, because it's not just extreme violence, but it's like gritty, realistic kind of violence. Like, there's not a gallon of blood spit in here. It's just a man screaming in horrific pain.
Well, and Park Chan-wook, particularly in this instance, does something really cool where he'll like show a close up of the teeth, the claw of the hammer around the tooth, and you can hear the scraping of the metal on the tooth. That's enough to freak me out. And I'm like, dude, you didn't even need to have the guy screaming, or later on you see the blood all over the floor, but like, man, oh man, like just the claw of that hammer on that tooth scraping around, that gets me every time.
And,
but the hammer becomes like his weapon of choice throughout the rest of this film.
Not talk about this movie without talking about the hallway fight,
right?
Which is,
it's hammer time.
Yeah, buddy.
And every time I watch it, that's what I say to myself. I'm like, oh, here it comes. It's hammer time. Because it's like a video game.
Yeah. And amazingly, it's a long take. There's no cuts in it. It's just this amazing, amazing fight that he really does hold his own quite well. The only significant damage he takes is he gets stabbed in the back.
Stabbed in the back, and the knife just hangs out in his back for like the rest of the fight, and it's so good.
But the thing I've always found really, really fascinating about this, especially in terms of Asian cinema, actually specifically, which is famous for its very long fight scenes, is that it's well choreographed, but they get exhausted by the end. Like, nobody is in the fight by the end of it. I
And it
think
gives it that realism.
someone like breaks a 2x4 over his back, and then like everybody's like stumbling around, and he throws like the last little piece of the broken 2x4 at him, and it's just so pathetic at that point.
And yet it's so realistic, as you mentioned. That's what Park Chan-wook does with the sequence, is that his action in all three of these films, when there is action, this one is definitely the most action oriented of them. It's realistic. That fight scene, I'm exhausted by the end of that fight scene. I'm as tired as they are, and I'm just sitting on my ass watching this movie. And that's a testament to how good that fight scene is, and how realistic it feels ultimately as it's scanning down this hallway, doing a left and right pan, like a beat 'em up game from the old NES era. And I think that's a testament to Park Chan-wook's creativity and simplicity.
So then basically, and at this point he gives him the ultimatum. He says, you have 5 days to figure out why I imprisoned you and who I am. And if you do that, I'll kill myself. But if you fail, I'm going to kill your girlfriend, the sushi chef. So that ends up in a really bad situation. And now he's got a time limit because he is starting to kind of fall for the sushi chef. In a large way, I think, because it's the first person who showed him kindness since he's been out. We do end up finding out that there was a little bit of hypnotic suggestion involved in that particular love as well. This movie does play with the idea of hypnosis a little bit. That may be the most unrealistic aspect of it. However, in the fiction of the movie, it's such a minor detail generally that it's almost, I don't know, it's never really bothered me. It just is one of those things, like, as I'm saying it right now, I'm like, hypnosis is one of those kind of tropes in movies where it's a shortcut, basically.
It's certainly convenient. And I think in this film, it serves as a convenience. It also serves as a way to, get the characters where they need to be and give us an explanation, because otherwise it still might be too hard to believe in that.
Yeah.
And so, it gives us an out for a lot of things. It also, as we'll get to here in a second for the ending, comes back once again to play a really pivotal role thematically as we look into it. And at the hypnotism, I'm glad you brought this up, because this is something that's specific to this film and not to the franchise itself. But the hypnotism is really interesting. And the first time I remember watching this movie, and I remember thinking the same thing. Oh man, the hypnotism, that is such a cop out. Like, really, you're going to go with hypnotism in this? And then, funny enough, the remake, Spike Lee's remake, I know I'm bringing this up. I'm opening up a bucket of worms. I'm just going to dump these worms on top of my head.
I was going to save it for after, but it's almost impossible to not touch on the Oldboy remake, although it's certainly not worth dwelling on.
Right, exactly. And I'm not going to dwell on this because I don't think that's really part of this franchise. I mean, we can chat about it a little bit more, at the end if we choose to. I choose to kind of forget it exists. But the one major difference that film makes from this one in terms of its narrative is it completely removes the hypnotism.
Mm-hmm.
There is no mention of the hypnotism. And as I was watching that film and I got to the end, I thought to myself, boy, that hypnotism, that really worked the first time around, and it is missing. And when it's gone out of that remake, it leaves so many massive plot holes. It leaves so many questions unanswered. And had I not seen the original one, I'd have probably been like, what the fuck is this movie? I don't understand this narrative. I can't even imagine the original one is any good.
Yeah. As a matter of fact, and really, yeah, well, we can touch on it a little bit. Jumping ahead, basically, the narrative kind of bounces around at this point a little bit, but the head it comes to is that after the first time he has sex with his sushi chef girlfriend, he ends up, Jesus, it's revealed to that it is actually his long lost daughter, and that was kind of stage one of our villain's revenge. So he's got a whole new fresh reason to be super pissed, and ends up finding out basically the basic thrust of it is when Odesu was a child, what, 12 or whatever, you know, they were grade schoolers, he ends up seeing the villains, and I'm only referring to him as a villain because I can't think of his name, but kidnapper and his sister making out or kind of having an incestuous moment in a classroom. And he told his friend, the rumors spread about it, and it ultimately led to the sister killing herself. And so what the real twist of this movie is you spend the whole time with Odesu thinking we're following his story of revenge, when in fact, it's the kidnapper's revenge story. And that's where it kind of pulls a fast one on you. And it's like, actually, that is the greatest revenge plot I've ever heard. It's insane and evil and horrible, but you really in prison for 15 years and tricked into banging your own daughter. Like, holy shit. And it was an incest revenge. That was the point.
Right. That's the point, is like, that's his whole point. And it's one of those concepts, again, like, you have to take it with a grain of salt to just be able to go with it. Because, like, even as you're sitting there explaining it, I'm like, man, that's a hard pill to swallow.
Yeah.
You know, in terms of a narrative or a plot point, there's two lines that set this up at the finale that I think really work for me on setting up the expectation of what's going to happen. So when the villain calls our protagonist, he tells him, you know, that you are asking the wrong questions. You're asking who imprisoned you when you should be asking why you were imprisoned. And he tells him that right away. And that's what kind of leads Odesu to, you know, go back to his old school and kind of uncover who this villain is. And once he uncovers who it is, he can kind of put together the why. And even then, he doesn't even know. There's this idea that he started this rumor, which ended up getting the sister killed, you know. So that's the first line, is the why. And then later on, there's a line that said, are you, it's something to the effect of, are you looking for revenge or the truth, to Odesu? And I think that's a really key one here, because the whole time he's looking for revenge and he doesn't care about the truth, when the two are actually interlinked. That's revealed in this finale.
But
Uh, yeah.
incidentally, one of the minor themes, and again, one that's kind of unique to this one within the trilogy, is something that is completely tertiary in Odesu's life. He never thought about it again after he told his friend, oh yeah, no, I just saw these two kids making out. How weird is that? And then he moved to a different school and never thought about it again for 30 years, and it completely changed our villain's life. It's that small moment, and it's perception. It's what's nothing to one person is everything to someone else.
Right. And what's funny is, in my notes as I was going through it, I wrote the ending, comma, decisions of the insane. And it's so funny because, like, you're right, it's like this villain was, you kind of get the idea he was off his rocker to begin with, right?
Sure.
But, and, you know, this massive 15-year plan, and it's not even 15 years, it's 15 years since Odesu was imprisoned. We're talking like a
It's 40.
30-year
Yeah.
plan that
Jesus.
he came up with, that he could, for
Break it down
15
like
years.
that. It really is crazy.
It's insane. It's insane. There's this villain is insane, and he's become this all-powerful person, this man in the high tower who, like, sits on top of his castle and puppeteers all these things that are going on in Odesu's life. And you start off hating Odesu. This guy is, you get this idea, he was never a good husband, he was never a good father, he was never there, he was
Eat him
drunk.
thinking drunk. Yeah.
Yeah, he's drunk to begin with. He's acting like an idiot as in this police station. He only gets out because he pays his way out. You get the idea that he's not a good person. And so by the end of this film, which is, again, a testament to Park Chan-wook's ability to craft a narrative, is that you actually kind of feel for him. And you're like, this guy is an awful human being. He in any other movie, Odesu is the villain.
What I
And,
think is kind of interesting is the choice Odesu's kind of given at the end too, because the real completion of the revenge is when he threatens to expose the truth to Midu. That was her name. The truth to his daughter. And that's when he realizes, no, he can't ruin her life too. And he starts begging on his hands and knees for forgiveness and acting like a dog and completely degrading himself to the point he cuts out his own tongue. And that's when the villain decides that that's enough. The secret is going to be kept forever, and then he promptly shoots himself in the elevator because suicide is a real theme of this movie, actually.
It is a super theme to the point where in the flashbacks to the old school days, the sister character that was killed of the villain is reading a Sylvia Plath book.
Oh my god, I don't even think I noticed that.
Yeah, this was something I was doing some research for another film project, and I was reading about Sylvia Plath, and actually I was doing for Iron Giant because Sylvia Plath, the Iron Giant was originally written by Sylvia Plath's husband as a way to explain her death to the kids.
Oh,
And
shit.
because she committed suicide, right? So yeah, that's something I learned the other day. So
Jesus, that wasn't heavy enough.
that's what the Iron Giant's about, yeah. But I digress. That's a whole different the tangent we can get on. But it's enough that I noticed that I happen to be doing this research. So when the sequence with the sister is reading a Sylvia Plath book, who's a very famous person who committed suicide, and so suicide happens again and again and again in this movie. And you talk about a downer movie. That's what Oldboy is. Oldboy is like the epitome of a downer, a lonely downer film, and it's executed so well that it's a film that I've watched multiple times. First Blu-ray I ever bought because it's that good. And I think that's again, Park Chan-wook just nails this as the second part of his Vengeance trilogy. Nails it.
To put a little button on the synopsis of this movie, and just to emphasize my point that none of these movies are about particularly great people, though,
Yeah.
is the fact that the actual ending is Odesu contacting the hypnotist again. And she comes to him, and the line comes back, even though I'm no better than a beast, do I not still deserve to live? And it kind of takes a new context at that point. And basically, he asks her to wipe out his memory of the truth so that he can live happily with Mito as his girlfriend, which is, boy, that's a Ferric victory. Jesus Christ.
Yeah, right. This is I know when we decided to do this trilogy, my first thought was like, I don't know if my soul can take this much, you know? Like watching all three of these movies in a row, oh, that's gonna grate on me a little bit. So,
It was
but yeah,
it was a dour weekend, I will say.
yeah, it goes there. But yeah, so that's kind of the gist of Oldboy. We talked a little bit about the themes of that film, the kind of individualistic themes there,
The
which
only button I would put on that, because we've already just really effused how much this was foundational to both of us. But I mean, how foundational this was to Asian cinema in the United States generally. Like, this movie really, really kicked open the door.
yeah, you and myself included, for a lot of young people, it was an introduction. It was a gateway.
We didn't have
Um,
Train to Busan. I think Park Chan Wook actually produced and co-wrote Snowpiercer, which I personally thought was phenomenal.
oh yeah, Snowpiercer is fantastic. We mentioned that Oldboy. Re- Park Chan Wook himself really solidified the new age of South Korean cinema and kind of stamping it on an international scene, saying, this is a country whose cinema should be taken seriously. It's a place where we have unique cinema. It's a place where we have
Before
fantastic.
there, before that, a lot of the cinema was basically kind of chasing Japanese trends in action, and that was their history for a long time. And then even a little bit before Old Boy, I'll give him credit. Like, you started getting things like Shiri and stuff like that, where they really started kind of forging their own identity. But I totally agree on the sense that Old Boy solidified it in a big way. This kind of gritty, grounded look that a lot of Korean dramas and action has.
And Oldboy leading into the next film, because as you mentioned, Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance, Oldboy, Lady Vengeance, bang, bang, bang. 3 years in a row. He's dropping these 3 films. Park Chan-wook follows up Oldboy with a film that probably, weirdly as it is, probably takes more swings and artistic choices, makes bolder artistic choices than either of these 2 films with Lady Vengeance or Sympathy for Lady Vengeance. This is the first film where, even though she's not necessarily a good character as a heroine for this, this is the first film where I do feel she's kind of a heroine.
Oh yeah, no. As soon as we were starting to come up on this, I realized I am a little mistaken. This one definitely has a distinct hero and villain, and we will tap on it a little bit. Gumja is not the kind person she seems to be. She definitely has a hard edge, and she's definitely made some mistakes. So, she's not like this pristine character, but she is distinctly the hero here, yes.
Right. And I think that's what sets this film aside from the other ones, in terms of she's flawed, right? You get this, and the film presents her as a manipulator, as
she's a schemer, yeah, for damn sure.
Yeah, to begin with in the film,
and not shy about violence. You end up realizing, and spoilers before we even start the synopsis, so that's great, but you end up realizing she actually doesn't have the body count you think she does. But the few times we do see her kill, she's not exactly shy about it.
Right. And you kind of get the idea that to begin with, she had made some mistakes. Life was hard for her, kind of going back to the themes of Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance, that circumstance led her down a road where she could not get out of. And so the film actually starts with her being released from prison after
a Tarantino-esque way. Yeah.
Right. 13 and a half years, which I find it very strange. It was 13 and a half years.
Specifically released on parole for good behavior.
Yep. So, because that's where she gets her name, the kind-hearted, they refer to her as an angel in the prison. She's like this nice person who takes care.
Model for prisoner reform.
Yeah. She becomes a baker in prison, things like that. But the film starts off that there's like this church choir that's there to greet her as she's leaving. There's this preacher that's there that she's been working with, and
this block of tofu
is yep, the block of tofu that he gives to her, as they're saying it. The film is distinctly during the winter time. It's Christmas time. The choir's actually in Santa outfits, which is unique compared to the other 2 films. In those regards, she's released from prison, and like the first thing she says to the preacher is like, "Go screw yourself." And it's amazing. It's great. It's a great introduction. I've read that before in like screenwriting or in film analysis. The one thing you always want to do is the hardest thing to ever do is introduce a character. This movie nails her introduction by having that sequence, because you get this idea that she's this nice lady, all this church is there for her, and she tells the preacher to go screw himself and like walks off. And it's amazing. It's a fantastic opening.
So this narrative definitely bounces around the most. It's kind of the hardest to track, but the short version of it is she murdered like a kindergartner.
Yeah, 5 years old. Yep.
Smothered him to death. And while she's in prison, she spends her time, it's almost told in a small vignette way through these flashbacks, that she spends her time basically befriending this group of women in the prison. And as we're following the narrative kind of straight through, she uses and taps on all these women to help her track down the man she feels wronged her. So we get a couple of interesting little tidbits of her personality. There is one lady being sexually assaulted by a bully in the jail, and Gumja, boy, I'm going to say that different every goddamn time. Gumja basically kills her. I mean, really slowly, but she does. She kills her over the course of 3 years because she ends up slicking up the floor of the bathroom with soap.
With soap. It's like, that might be my favorite comedic scene in any of these movies, is that soap sequence. Because that lady just like starts walking and she goes down hard. And the best part is you see her in the background like doing something on the floor, but you're not really paying attention to it because there's like kind of a grotesque scene going on in the foreground, and you see this like her in the background with the soap, and when she goes down, I literally have to pause this movie every time because I'm laughing so hard. That stunt and the way it's shot, just aces all the way around.
And just jumping straight to the punchline of that story, I've always also loved that Gumja volunteers to take care of her in the hospital and poisons her with bleach over the course of 3 years to finish the job.
And you even get to see it. There's a scene where she's like spoon feeding her like oatmeal, and she literally takes like this syringe of bleach and she's like spraying it on there like right in front of her, and
It's like, it's your medicine.
it's your medicine. It's so good. But that's what's interesting about this character, this lead character, is that she really is kind of this, for lack of a better term, angel of vengeance.
Yeah.
She's this person that brings justice to where it needs to be. And I think that's really interesting. And the film doubles down on a lot of things distinctive to the female gender and to a woman's role, including the fact that like the opening credit sequence is completely done almost evilly, showing a woman baking.
Yeah.
It's like flour, the white flour, and then the blades of bread knives and things like that. It shows it in kind of this sinister way, but it's actually this really creative and process of baking, which becomes a theme throughout this film. But I think that's really cool that the film navigates her character in such a way that you're like, she is not a nice lady necessarily. She kills people, but man, you're behind her 100% by the time they reveal kind of all the details behind her case.
And what is interesting and what we were touching on earlier about her being the most distinctly heroic is no matter her actions, there is this very, very strong sense of justice in what she's doing at every step, which is actually interesting for one of these characters having come 3 movies in now. Because most of these other characters are, deeply flawed. Even some of the women she helps, like she makes friends with North Korean spy who's imprisoned next to her, ends up, netting her plans for a really cool gun. But like she really, she's definitely manipulating the situation, and she's definitely got her own end game. But there is this kind of justice to what she's doing, because this North Korean spy is also like 1,000 years old and considered a burden to everybody on the staff, and she very kindly did take care of her.
Right. Yeah, her sheer willpower and the performance of the actress in that role just completely sells it, and it's a phenomenal. And like you said, the narrative of this film does a lot of jumping. He takes a lot of more artistic moments with it, plays a lot more with expectations on the audience. And for me, it doesn't work quite as well as the other two in terms of a narrative, but her performance and her like that character carries this film. It could carry a film that's half as good as this, and it would still be a classic.
Because I think even though the plot is a little shakier, if you're strictly talking about it in a plot sense, I think the emotional core of this movie is the strongest of the 3 to me. Just on the sense that I care more about these characters than almost any of his other characters. Like when Gumja does well, I'm happy. When things go a little rougher for her, I'm really bummed. Her meeting her daughter for the first time and kind of getting the cold shoulder. Sorry, we should backpedal that a little bit. So
yeah, we she just got out of prison.
What we end up finding out is that basically 13 years ago, she was pregnant, and her parents basically kicked her out for all intents and purposes. And she calls this teacher that she really liked, who basically agrees to take her in, but she has to give him, basically sexual favors at his whim, and she has to help him with his kidnapping racket, his secret kidnapping racket. So it was a kidnapping gone bad, and he accidentally killed the child, but basically told Gumja that she had to unequivocally take the blame, or else he was going to kill her then born infant daughter. So she takes the blame. Infant daughter gets sent to Australia, as we mentioned a little earlier. And Gumja does get the money because she's calling in all these favors from these friends she made. So she has money and she has weapons and clothes and food, and she's doing pretty good for herself outside of prison. And she goes to Australia, and there is this kind of really heart-wrenching scene where initially her daughter doesn't take to her. There's a language gap to begin with, but then she decides she's coming back to Seoul with Gumja in one of those moments that makes me laugh so hard because it's so blatantly, almost cartoonishly insane, where basically this little girl demands to go to Korea with her real birth mother by standing in front of her adopted parents with a knife to her throat.
Yeah, yeah, because as we've discerned now, suicide in a Park Chan-wook film is just par for the game. But yeah, so yeah, she meets her daughter, takes her to Seoul, puts together her plan. They talk again about the long game plan. All of the women she met in prison, they're like, is your plan started yet? Have you started your plan yet? Because she's been planning this for 13 years, because it's not a Park Chan-wook vengeance film unless there is a long-term, decades-long game plan for revenge to come out. And so she gets her daughter's there, kind of complicates things a little bit more, but ultimately this film has the most simplistic plot, even though the narrative is more complicated. She ends up finding the teacher that had kidnapped these children. Interestingly enough, brings it to the police and says, I want your help finding the parents for these children, for this guy. I have him.
The backstepping a little bit. She's got a gun to his head and she's actually about to kill him when she looks at his cell phone and sees the child that she took the blame for, his marble at the end of his cell phone. And then she looks up and there's more baubles from more children. So she tears his house apart and finds VHS tapes of him. It turns out it was never a kidnapping ring, he was a serial killer. So it was
Right.
always going to end in this little boy's death.
Yep. And he's killed multiple kids. She ends up, she has him kidnapped.
Yeah, she backsteps and does not take her revenge. Instead, she finds the parents of all of the children he killed.
Yep. And presents them with an option and says, basically, you can share in my revenge. She proves to them, she shows them the videotapes, proves to them that their children were indeed, and some of those videotapes are hard to watch.
Ooh.
They are,
I remembered that actually, it actually caught me off guard. There's one where he specifically is hanging this girl and you literally see him pull the ladder from under her.
Yeah, it is shocking. So the film does not hesitate to kind of showcase that, again, for the purpose of justifying this revenge in a lot of ways. And, at that point, she shares, again, as an angel of vengeance, she has brought this gift, again, kind of going with the themes of Christmas here, the season of giving, which happens again and again. There's a lot about this, about like it's a give and take kind of world, that she gifts them with this opportunity to have their own vengeance on him along with her. And it's weirdly a heartwarming scene, as violent as it is, because you're like, this is all these parents who have suffered, and
Closure. It's offering him closure.
it's closure, and it's an interesting scene how it plays with that.
She actually offers him the choice to take him to the cops and do it right.
Yeah, the cop is there. The detective that investigated her case, she includes him on it, and he seems to be game with all of this because the justice system was flawed enough that she was blamed for this. And
for over a decade. And she feels a new type of guilt by realizing if she had come out against him earlier, these children would have been spared.
Right. Yep. And, and ultimately, this is kind of how the film ends. At this point, it hits a denouement where it kind of drops. It ties together a little bit with her daughter and the weird makeshift family she has created with one of the fellow bakers in the restaurant she's been working in, who has,
during the opening scene, she actually makes a perfectly white cake for her daughter and tells her, be white, which in this context is saying be pure, be innocent. And it's really kind of heartwarming when she goes, her daughter turns the cake back to her and says, you know, for me to do that, you have to be pure. I need the example. And it's this moment where her daughter's offering redemption, and it's really kind of beautiful. I think probably the only character in this entire franchise who gets anything even akin to redemption. This is the only movie with a happy ending or
Yeah.
anything close to it.
Despite the fact that there's so many characters, I mean, it's revenge, right? There's this idea of like redemption at the end of revenge. That's always kind of the goal of revenge. So all of these movies are characters looking for redemption. And this is the only one where any character even feels like you, as an audience, you feel like there's any resemblance of redemption by the end of the film. And I think that's what really sets it apart again from the other two.
So, rolling into themes as a franchise, I think one of the biggest and most obvious is kidnapping. Kidnapping and false imprisonment is just paramount to all of these movies.
Well, yeah. It's absolutely, that was one of the things that I wrote down as I was doing my analysis of this, was the themes of prisons and the themes of false imprisonment. I think you're absolutely right there. Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance. It's a prison created by society and the economy.
Mm-hmm.
It's these circumstances that create this prison for these characters that end up pushing them towards revenge. And Oldboy, it's physically a private prison, and then the prison of your past choices.
Yeah.
You know, as little as they were, as you kind of
Your
mentioned.
memories. Yeah.
Yep. And then with, Lady Vengeance, you have that
Present.
the literally the prison sequence, which is, and I should have brought this up when we were talking about it, but I feel is heavily influenced by the female prisoner Scorpion series.
Mm.
In a lot of ways, is particularly that first act with this idea that the prison is its own society, its own problems that you have to navigate, and I think that's a huge theme to it, along with, like you said, kidnapping.
Then I think another theme that's less necessarily obvious, but is very, very much in play, is the price of revenge. Just in the sense that nobody comes out of this unscathed. Even Lady Vengeance, which, like we said, is definitely the happiest of them. Happy.
That was, for those listening out there, there was air quotes that went with happy.
even at that, she, like I said, she has to come to that gut-wrenching realization that if she had outed him at the beginning, it had saved, I mean, it's the trolley problem. She might have lost her daughter, but it has saved, what, 5, 6, 7, 8 other children?
Yeah.
So, she feels immensely guilty about that. And there's just the guilt of giving up her child. And yeah, no, that definitely, there's price. The price of revenge. Nobody comes out unscathed. Odesu, obviously.
No, that's and judging by your pause there, that's what's really interesting, because like with your themes of morality, like we're talking about with revenge and the price of revenge, like Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance is a movie all about the gray.
Yeah.
Lady Vengeance is all about black and white. There's this idea of black and white, the be white, be pure. She wears only black. She has like a black leather jacket through the entire third act.
Blood red eyeshadow so she would look less kind.
Yeah. And so it's black and white for Lady Vengeance, and Oldboy, all black.
Yeah.
I'm not sure there's like an ounce of daylight in there. And what daylight there is, whatever, glimpse of hope or anything, that movie only uses it to crush it. And it's fascinating to kind of go into that, because nobody comes out unscathed. In Oldboy, nobody comes out unscathed. Nobody, not a single person.
Oldboy is a special particular case, because not only does nobody come out unscathed, but in that particular one, like, everybody is brutalized. And I mean, both, like, not only emotionally but physically, in every sense of the word, they are brutalized. And every character, the villain, I mean, he ends up not as happy with his revenge as he thought he'd be. He's giggling and it's fun for him until it's not, and then he just kills himself because there's literally nothing left. He focused so much of his life on this plan that he had nothing left at all. You know, it plays a flashback where he remembers his sister, possibly even implies he might have had a more heavy hand in her death, and then he just shoots himself.
Yeah.
Um,
It's nobody comes out unscathed. And in Lady Vengeance, there's, like you said, it's probably the most hopeful, at least for her character, this idea of rekindling her relationship with her daughter. She's developed all of these skills now that she could use to kind of move on with her life. It doesn't answer the question of whether she can.
because that's not what the movie's about.
That's not what the movie's about. And I think it's a phenomenal analysis of the morality of, flawed people in situations that take advantage of those flaws. And
Um,
it makes it hard.
I especially think Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance has the most sympathetic characters, just in the sense that Ryu is just a decent guy caught in a series of horrifying circumstances. Like, that one's probably the most gut wrenching, just on the level of, like, there's literally no fault in that movie. Outside of the sense of, I mean, I keep conveniently forgetting he does kidnap a child, but
Yeah.
was not trying to kill her, and her even dying was a circumstance of him being deaf. It actually makes a point that it's hip deep water. He absolutely could have saved her if he'd heard her.
Yeah. Well, and I think it brings up the point that we talked about, the flawed characters in these films that go over everything. And what's interesting, I talked briefly about in Oldboy that he's kind of a man child. He's super selfish throughout the film, super selfish until the very end. And even then, it's maybe not for the right reason that he's not selfish.
Oh no, I'm gonna strong disagree. I think the actual button ending with the hypnotist proves he's still completely in his own self interest.
Absolutely. So I agree. So with that, Lady Vengeance, you have that same idea of this person. She was in a bad situation. She was pregnant as a little kid, got into a bad situation. She ends up having to be a manipulator, a pretender, a player, whatever you want, to be able to get to where she wants to be. But Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance is really interesting because his flaw is, particularly for Rio, his flaw is that he just exists in a place that nobody notices him.
Yeah, he
You know?
he's poor, he's downtrodden. The reason his first thoughts to go after his boss's daughter is that he is recently laid off. He'd taken so much time off trying to get this organ deal that he got fired over it. Like, this is just circumstance after circumstance pushing him to make choices he didn't want to have to make. And the other thing I think is worth mentioning here is, outside of Gumja, none of the protagonists are particularly bright. And I don't even mean that as an insult. Like, they're just very kind of street level. Odesu's a salaryman. Ryu is a factory worker. And it's not that Kevin Smith world where, your 7-Eleven employee is, wittily dissecting Star Wars. It's the real world. He's just a dude. He goes home to his girlfriend. His girlfriend doesn't seem all that bright either. She's just a anarchist shouting on street corners and stuff. The fact that it ends up being a real terrorist organization at the end is almost incidental to the character.
Right. Well, and I even think with Rio, what's really interesting is there's two key sequences in Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance that kind of indicate this idea of that he is like he's so low on the rung of society that nobody notices him, that he's almost invisible to other characters, which is why he's able to kind of get away with what he does. There's actually three key sequences. The first one, there's the sequence in the bathroom when he goes to the bathroom and the cleaning lady, it starts off showing the cleaning lady and she's just cleaning around him as he's peeing at the toilet. She's in like he's not even there, right? That's kind of the opening sequence where you kind of see that he's an invisible person. And then there's the sequence later where, as we mentioned before, he's burying his sister at the lake. Does nobody see that? Does nobody he transports a dead body out to the lake, again, kind of going that maybe he's not the brightest bulb on the Christmas tree, that, he doesn't like, can't afford a funeral, I would assume, right? Nobody notices that he's done this, and nobody finds her body until later, like much later.
It's actually literally an accident, and it's only because the girl's father is at the lake where she was murdered at an impasse in his investigation of the whole thing, and he's skipping stones and he just picked the right one up and found her hand. Like it was a
Yeah.
million to one.
Right. And so that's kind of the second one. And then the third one, which is, it might be the most emotional moment for this entire trilogy for me, like it breaks my heart, is the sequence where his girlfriend has been killed by the father, and they have her in the elevator. They can't even get her out of the room, her dead body. So they have her like on a stretcher leaning up in the elevator, and he's standing next to her because he goes back to find her, and he's literally standing next to her, and he takes her hand in the elevator, his dead girlfriend's hand that he's standing next to. The police are all there looking for him. He's literally standing next to all the police that are out searching for him with his girlfriend, and he takes her hand with it as they leave the elevator. And I think that is like, it's a heartbreaking moment, and it's also totally indicative to this idea that nobody notices him, to the point where even when people are looking for him, he's completely invisible to the world. And that is completely heartbreaking to me in that moment. And I think that moment really resonates with me and hits me in all the feelings, all of them. It hits all of them.
Another major theme throughout them, weirdly, we touched on the black humor, but is also torture. Torture actually features prominently in all of them, and they're really, really some, I mean, it's stuff like I mentioned earlier, ripping a dude's teeth out with a claw hammer. We mentioned the father in Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance tortures the anarchist girlfriend to death. He does this by, licking her earlobes and sticking a car battery to it and just like electrocuting her slowly. Like when he's actually done and is planning to kill her, he just flips the switch and walks away, like a total Taken moment. Shit, which came first? Taken might have stolen that actually.
Oh yeah, totally. Because Taken would have been too late 2000s. Yeah. So it's interesting because that flawed protagonist that goes through it is not just like the normal flawed protagonist. It's to the point where it's like this emotional core flaw, or it's a flaw that's presented upon them. It's not even theirs. It's something that's, in for Ryu, it's society can't see him. For her, it's because she got with the wrong guy at the wrong time and ended up being forced to take the blame.
Which, speaking of Gumja, let's not take away her awesome moment of torture when she realizes she can't kill him and she needs to look for these kids' parents. She takes her two-shot gun and blows off both of his big toes.
Yeah, yeah. With this big gun that when she makes it, the gunsmith kind of goes to her and he's like, "This is the most inaccurate gun I've ever seen."
Yeah, he basically goes, "Do you understand how close you're gonna have to be to kill anyone with this?"
It's amazing. Yeah.
A neat action sequence where her plot almost gets found out for a second, and there's a couple of thugs coming after her, and there's this moment where basically she shoots the one guy, she's coming after the other guy, almost shoots, and there's actually a moment of voiceover where it goes, even in a moment of panic and desperation, she never forgot the range of the gun, and she takes 2 steps forward and puts it right against his temple.
Yeah. And did you weird theme, because one of the things that this trilogy does is that there's a lot of actors that reprise roles, and not like characters,
Because,
but actors that'll be in it. Did you
yeah.
notice who those two thugs were?
Oh no, who?
It's Ryu and the father from Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance. Those
Really?
are the two thugs. Yep, the actors.
The serial killer is Odesu too.
Yep. So
Yeah.
yeah, Choi Min-sik is the villain in Lady Vengeance, and also Odesu in Oldboy. So that's one of those things, is there's a shared use of a lot of smaller actors
I feel
throughout.
like Umja was Mr. Vengeance too. Feel like.
Yeah. So there's a lot of that kind of
Yeah.
shared staff that
Yeah,
obviously part.
certainly. Yeah, it's certainly not crazy to call it a trilogy in a sense. Certainly
Right.
not.
Right.
Um,
Well, and I think at this point, we should bring up here's this trilogy that exists, right? I think it's a phenomenal trilogy. The It makes an international impact. It comes in, pops everybody, pops them square in the jaw. Here's Park Chan-wook is like, here I am, right? Here is my Vengeance trilogy, bang, 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 3 years in a row. And all, if memory serves right, all three films were bought for remake, the rights for all three.
yes.
I know Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance was purchased for remake. Oldboy was obviously remade by Spike Lee, who in himself is a fantastic director, fantastic filmmaker, but it's not shown in that movie.
I'm uh,
So,
I'm a little iffier on him, but I certainly think he's better than Old Boy. Yes, I'll agree with that.
so Oldboy gets remade as an American film. It's a flop, a massive flop here in the US. Um,
And it's without putting too fine a point on it, because I really don't think we want to focus too much on this remake in any way, shape, or form outside of the compare and contrast of it's one of those situations where I feel like it was made by somebody who missed the point. And it's really, really frustrating because Old Boy is this kind of unflinching look at human darkness and kind of what we're capable of. And Spike Lee used it as a platform for his themes instead of telling the story that was there. Um, and so there's a lot more kind of focus on class and racial stratification in Old Boy that just doesn't exist in the original. I'm not saying those are not worthy themes for exploring, but save it for 25th Hour. Like that's not what this movie was.
well, and that's what makes it interesting because when coming to remakes, because obviously no franchise fatigue, I have nothing against remakes.
Oh,
A good
certainly.
movie is a good movie is a good movie, and I think that's what's interesting about Old Boy is that I don't necessarily think that the movie the Old Boy remake falls into this weird spot where it's not different enough to truly be its own thing, and yet it's different just enough that it misses a lot of what was great about the original. It's in this weird sweet spot of failure. and and if I think if Spike Lee had run even further with his themes in it, I think it might have been a better film.
It could have certainly been. I will say it would have certainly been more interesting because
Right.
that's and the biggest insult I can give to any movie. But really, the big problem with the American Old Boy remake is that it's just boring.
Greatest sin a movie can ever make is that it's boring, and I totally agree. And it's weird because I like Spike Lee as a director. I like the cast that's in it,
But he's not
and
an
it
action director, so you got things like the hammer scene is just atrocious in the remake.
right. And it's interesting that he did kind of essentially similar concept one, but again, like you don't want to remake it shot for shot. You don't want to remake it shot because there's only one shot. Oh, so you don't want to remake it that way because then you're just harping on it. So you want to honor it and things. But yeah, like I don't think that movie works at all. And I'm always curious though, like with the rights for the other two being done, obviously the failure of Old Boy is pretty much going to seal the fate that they will never get remade. Not at least for an American audience. Maybe some other country may tackle it.
Mr. Vengeance had some traction a few years ago, but boy, I don't think there's been any news about either of them. I actually think you're right since the Spike Lee remake came out.
Yeah, I think that pretty much just sealed the deal on killing any of those. But like, I think Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance would be really interesting because, remaking that in any kind of different country where you can add in different things about society or the economy might
So
be an interesting way to approach it.
I completely agree. I do. I can see a version of this that's more American Gangland, a departed to China's infernal affairs, so to speak. Uh,
Right. All right. Well, I think that's kind of wrapping up this. We have at least one thing to do is we got to rank these bad boys.
Gotta do it.
Okay, what's your number three?
Um. So as much as I do personally adore it, and it is a great movie, Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance is my number three. Just on the level of as good as it is, it's one of those movies where I can only watch it with this deep sense of pity. I never get that super emotional connection where I find anyone where I'm like, I have trouble relating to the characters, despite the fact that I find the story compelling. It's just not something I relate to personally. And like I said, this is difference in degrees here, but
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think that should be noted probably initially is that I believe all of these films are nearly perfect. All
absolutely.
three. So it really is, like I said, on any given day my three can change. So I my number three is gonna be Lady Vengeance.
Okay.
The reason being is that I find the narrative, the kind of disjointed narrative, the time leaping narrative that's in there to not work as well as, say, the more straightforward narratives of both Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance and Old Boy. I think the performances rock. The just that disjointed feeling. It's a movie where there's multiple narrators, like voiceover narrators, where characters speak directly to the camera and tell you things. And for the most part, that kind of voiceover narration is not something I love. Old Boy is like one of the few times where I'm like, yes, the voiceover narration actually adds to the film.
Yeah. Which, speaking of, my number two is in fact Old Boy. I I adore this movie. I do. Old Boy is a movie I could not heap enough praise on, but I do think that again, it's just a matter of the fact that the movie can be the best movie ever. Like if every character's an asshole, it's just really hard to like hook on to anything. And this is the movie where all the characters are like blatantly shitty people, like all of them. You know, Ryu and Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance, uh, not great people, but at least they're not like malicious. Everybody in Old Boy is just kind of a prick.
Yeah, absolutely. Believe it or not, my number two is also Old Boy,
Uh,
and for
I was
essentially the same reasons.
yeah, that's fun.
it's
So
it's
yeah,
a film.
it's a list. But yeah,
It's a film that I love. It was a huge impactful thing for me in my early 20s. It hit me in all the right ways. And then but still it's a movie that's hard to watch and it's a soul-crushing film. And
yeah,
so it's a five-star film as far as I'm concerned, but just because it's one of those films that by the end of it, I it's so hard to watch and by the end of it I just kind of feel hollow.
yeah.
And that's the point of the film, so I cannot detract it for that. But it's also a film that, when compared to the other, at least to my number one choice, it's a hard watch.
Yeah. Whereas for me, number one is Lady Vengeance. Although I actually agree with you on the overall narrative in the sense that I don't. I did mention earlier, and I won't fully retread this territory, but I don't think as a whole the narrative is perfect. But if we go by specifically the individual vignettes, some of those are so strong and so compelling, and they tell such a good story so fast. This bully we mentioned, her backstory is told in 15 seconds. 15 seconds of film, but everything about it, down to the style of how it's filmed, is everything. It's shot like it's a 1950s like sitcom, and she's standing over this grill, and it's only in the voiceover that you understand that she had caught her husband cheating on her, murdered them both, and was standing there barbecuing their corpses and eating them as the cops are completely surrounding her with their guns pointed. It's amazingly shot.
I agree. Yeah, I guess I agree on that. Like the pieces themselves are really, really well done. And I am a huge fan of the female prisoner scorpion series. And the first third of Lady Vengeance really hits a lot of sweet spots for me in terms of those vignettes, in terms of introducing all of these interesting characters that may only have one other scene beyond the prison sequence. And that's a really interesting way to approach it. Again, I think it's a movie that takes bold swings. It's just not all the swings hit for me.
And you do, sometimes it can just be as easy as something in the ending, and there is something about the totality of Gumja's journey to the point where she, basically refuses the tofu at the beginning, but then she's offering the cake to her daughter at the end. and begging her to live a happy, pure life. And, you know, there's so much kind of mourning in that because basically she's trying to spare her daughter the pain she went through that just really hooked me right, you know, this time through. And honestly, even a week ago before my last rewatch of these movies, Oldboy was my favorite. It literally switched with this watch through, but for whatever reason, maybe I'm getting older, something about that relationship really hooked me at the end.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Which I guess brings me to my number one, as I'm sure everyone can guess at this point, is Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance. I think this is a movie where, for such a young filmmaker, he makes bold choices, including having your main protagonist be a deaf mute throughout the film. That makes it really hard.
I actually, we didn't even touch on it, but I like the way that's presented in the movie too, because anytime something is blatantly from Ryu's perspective, the sound drops out. And I really like that. And instead of narration, it puts up title cards like a silent film. And I really like that detail too.
Yeah. And even not even all the times when he's signing will it put up title cards. Like sometimes you just have to relate to how the other actor is reacting to
Yeah.
what he's saying. And I think that's fantastic. I think it's a bold choice. I think it works. I like the twisty narrative. I think the choices it makes in terms of having essentially shifting protagonists into the second half of it to the father figure, and that finale gets me every time with the terrorist group. It gets me every. I forget it happens.
Mhm.
I'm watching this movie and I'm like, son of a bitch, it gets me every time. And I just think that that movie, as you said, it has this emotional core to it that either resonates or doesn't. And I think for me, it's one that resonates really well. As I mentioned, the elevator scene is a scene that like I get goosebumps every time I watch that movie. And I've watched that movie probably a dozen times at this point in my life.
Oh, and for me, the scene where the boss goes to the first person he thinks might have kidnapped his daughter, and it was an employee that had threatened him earlier because he was begging for a raise because he couldn't afford anything, and he goes to this guy's house and realizes that he poisoned his entire family to spare him from starving to death. And there was like this one little boy who was barely holding on, rushes him to the hospital, claims it's his son, and then at the end gets this call that the boy had passed, and he's just like, I don't know who you're talking about, and click, and it's really sad.
And the reason Old Boy's not my number one is because it leaves me feeling hollow. I think this film does too. It certainly is a soul crushing experience to see all of these people trying to do their best in their situations and repeatedly failing miserably. And none of it is their fault. And so it's for me, and it's an emotional roller coaster because you want to see them succeed. It's, Lady Vengeance, you certainly want to see her succeed, but I think in this one, even the kidnapping, they kidnap a little girl, and you still want to see him succeed because it's for a legitimate cause, and nobody will give them the time of day for it because of where they're at. He's a factory worker, you know, and it's something that I think rings really true to a lot of different things, to different people, different economies, you name it.
Frankly, if any one of the three would be, I think, the most appropriate to remake in an American context, can you imagine that movie's story with an American healthcare theme?
It would. I actually think it'll work.
Yeah,
I think it would work great. Old Boy, when they announced Old Boy remake, didn't think it was going to work. I'm like, that is a movie that
it's such
will
an
not
Asian
translate.
story. I don't even. I mean, just frankly, like that is such an Asian story in how it's told and everything about how it's presented. It's really hard to imagine any Western storytelling context because Western stories we operate in a three-act structure. Asian stories operate in a five-act structure, and there's always going to be some weird kind of there's going to be some square peg and round hole anytime you try and adapt something that distinctly Asian.
Yeah, absolutely, I agree. And yeah, so that's my number one, Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance.
Totally.
So
Well,
So I hope you all out there in audio land enjoyed our analysis of Park Chan-wook's Vengeance trilogy. We hope you tune in next time. Our next episode next month is going to be focused on the first four films of the Ring series. That is the Japanese first four films. That includes Ring, Ring 2, Ring Zero Birthday, and Spiral. So that'll be the first 4 films that we're covering. So if you guys are interested, please feel free to catch up on those films. It does get a release through a beautiful box set, Blu-ray box set through Arrow Video in October. So we hope that you kind of participate in that, watch it with us. So that way, when you come to it, you are spoiler free and we can really, really dig into it. So that'll be our next episode.
Which actually, admitting it's going to be my first time seeing 2 of these, actually.
Oh, I'm excited for you because I'm a huge fan of this franchise, and they are. Out of curiosity, is one of them Spiral? Have you seen Spiral yet?
Not, I've only seen the first 2.
You are in for a treat, my friend,
Although,
because that movie's insane.
weirdly true story, I have read the book series.
Oh well, then maybe you won't be so shocked because the movie Spiral, from what I hear, follows the books fairly well. So you'll have to be our book expert on this because I have not read the books. So.
But, yep, so I've been Sean. You can find my writing at
Blood Brothers Film Reviews.blogspot.com. You can find our writing there for some film reviews and analysis of different other pieces of cinema. You can also find me on Twitter at the Movie Matt. You can find me there. You can also find me on Facebook underneath my full name, Matt Reifschneider. If you know how to spell my last name, you just slap the keyboard twice. You're going to come pretty close to it. So. All right. Thank you so much, guys. Have a great evening. We will see you next month on No Franchise Fatigue.